The first laugh did not belong to her. It belonged to the man who ruled the room. In the grand ballroom of the Imperial Hotel, chandeliers rained gold light across polished marble. Dozens of guests in tailored suits and glittering gowns leaned toward the stage, waiting for the billionaire CEO, Richard Hale, to speak. Cameras flashed. Waiters moved like shadows between tables. And then it happened. A young waitress, Elena, stepped forward with a tray of glasses. Her English was clear but carried a light accent. She leaned toward one of the tables and asked quietly, "Would you like some water?" Richard's head turned sharply. His grin widened, but it was not kindness. "Water?" he echoed, stretching the word, twisting it into a joke. "Say it again. Perhaps this time we will understand." The insult shot across the hall like a whip. A few guests chuckled, nervous and shallow. Others shifted uncomfortably, their eyes fixed on their plates. The orchestra in the corner faltered, strings hanging mid-note. Silence fell harder than applause ever could. Elena froze for a moment. The tray trembled slightly in her hands, but she steadied it with practiced grace. Her uniform, crisp white shirt, black vest, dark apron, marked her as invisible. Service, not substance. Yet under the chandeliers she could not hide. Richard leaned closer, his voice sharp enough to cut. "This is the language of business. If you cannot master it, perhaps you should serve in another place." His cufflinks flashed under the light, silver against the black of his tailored suit. The cruelty was not about words. It was about dominance. Around the tables, the contrast glared, wealth and power standing tall against a single waitress with an accent. He carried billions in his signature. She carried glasses on a tray, he mocked. She endured, but something in her eyes pushed back. Lena did not bow her head. She did not rush away. She simply lifted her chin, just enough to look him directly in the eye. Her silence spoke louder than any reply. Richard smirked, raising his glass higher. "See, nothing to say." He invited the crowd's laughter, and some obeyed, brittle and false. Yet the sound faded quickly, dying in the weight of the room. A hush spread again. Guests who had laughed moments earlier now avoided looking at her. Others shifted uncomfortably, their pride pricked by the cruelty they had just witnessed but lacking courage to act. The orchestra players exchanged uncertain glances, bows still frozen above their strings. Elena set her tray down on the nearest table with calm precision. Every move was careful, deliberate, almost ceremonial. To Richard, it looked like submission. To the rest of the room, it was something harder to name. Her uniform, once a symbol of servitude, became something else in that moment. It was a mask. Beneath it lived a truth no one there had yet seen. She met Richard's gaze again, silent, unmoving. Her eyes burned with restrained defiance, as if a fire smoldered quietly beneath glass. The room held its breath. Chandelier light shimmered. Cutlery rested untouched, and every guest seemed to wait for her to break the silence. But she did not speak. Her silence was sharper than his insult. It was not weakness, but control, a choice to hold the storm inside for one more moment. And in that stillness, her eyes carried a promise. This humiliation was not the end. It was the beginning. The uniform was made of plain fabric, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unseen stories. Elena buttoned it each morning with steady hands. White shirt, black vest, long dark apron. To the world, it was nothing more than a waitress's attire. To her, it was a wall that kept her hidden even in plain sight. She had not been born into the glittering world she now served. Her earliest memories were of a modest home, where books stacked higher than furniture. Her parents had believed in study, not luxury. They taught her that language was not just sound. It was a key, a way to open locked doors. So she learned. At first one tongue, then another, and another still. Nights were spent tracing words under dim lamps, days reciting them until her voice grew tired. While others rested, she studied. While friends chased distractions, she carried dictionaries like companions. Every page she read was a step away from limitation, a step toward possibility. But possibility did not pay rent. So the uniform came. Service work offered steady wages, enough to cover bills and keep her standing in a city that did not forgive the poor. Each tray she carried was more than drinks. It was her shield against collapse. Each polite smile was a mask that concealed exhaustion, determination, and brilliance. Yet beneath that uniform, Elena held treasures no one could see. She could move between 9 languages with the ease of a pianist striking chords. She could read novels in their native text, understand speeches meant for kings, translate worlds that others could never reach. Still, here she was, balancing trays, clearing plates, answering to a man who mocked what he could not understand. There was sharp contrast in every step she took across the ballroom floor. The guests wore diamonds, yet some could not form a sentence outside their own tongue. Elena wore polyester, yet inside her rested the weight of 9 cultures, 9 histories, 9 voices. The difference was not ability but perception, and perception was shaped by the uniform she wore. She felt it pressed down on her shoulders as if the fabric itself whispered, "Stay small, stay silent." But silence had never been her natural state. She had been raised to believe that dignity was not given, it was carried. And so she carried it. The uniform did not erase her. It disguised her. It gave Richard Hale and others like him the illusion of superiority. They looked at her vest and apron and saw someone beneath them. They never imagined that inside the same body lived a mind sharper than their own. In truth, the uniform was a paradox. It trapped her in service, yet it also granted her access to the powerful halls she would otherwise never enter. It erased her identity, yet gave her the stage where her hidden brilliance would one day rise. That day was not far. For now, Elena moved among the tables quietly, her steps rehearsed, her smile fixed. But inside, every word she had studied, every night of sacrifice, every memory of struggle waited behind the mask of black and white cloth. The uniform covered her truth, but it could never erase it. Richard Hale wore power the way others wore clothing, carefully tailored, polished and meant to impress. From the stage, he looked unshakable. His suit was cut by the best hands in Europe. His watch gleamed like a crown on his wrist, and his voice carried the confidence of a man who had never been told no. To the crowd, he was not just a CEO. He was a symbol of wealth made flesh. But symbols are built, not born. Richard's rise had begun in lecture halls where his father's donations spoke louder than his own grades. Connections replaced effort. Where others studied late into the night, he dined with investors, learning the shortcuts of influence. By the time he launched his first company, his empire was already paved with family networks and hidden capital. Success arrived not as a reward for sacrifice, but as an inheritance he reshaped into dominance. And dominance became his addiction. The higher Richard climbed, the more he relied on spectacle. He learned that humiliation was a sharper tool than praise. Praise built loyalty, but ridicule built fear. And fear, he believed, lasted longer. So at board meetings, he targeted assistants. At public events, he mocked the staff. Every cutting remark was a performance, meant to remind others that he controlled the script. Behind the polished smile lay calculation. He knew laughter was a weapon. If the room laughed with him, then no one would dare laugh at him. Each insult he delivered to someone weaker was also a message to those stronger. Stay silent, or you could be next. The mask of power fit him well, but like all masks, it demanded constant maintenance. Every suit had to be flawless, every speech rehearsed, every smile sharpened at the edges. He lived in fear of cracks, because a single break could reveal the truth, that his empire was less about genius and more about inheritance, less about strength and more about show. That was why the waitress's silence unsettled him. He had expected stammering or retreat. He had expected the crowd's laughter to cover the cruelty. Instead, her steady eyes reflected something he rarely saw: resistance without words, a mirror held up to his own weakness. Richard brushed it off with a smirk, raising his glass higher, pressing the room to laugh louder. Yet a flicker of unease slipped into his chest. It was gone quickly, hidden beneath layers of arrogance, but it was there. The chandelier light glimmered across his face, hiding the small twitch in his jaw. He smiled wider, amplifying his performance. But those closest to him, the board members who watched every detail, caught the shadow of it. They noticed the shift, however slight. A man forced to work harder than usual to keep his mask from slipping. Richard Hale had spent a lifetime building his image of invincibility. He believed mockery kept it strong. But on that night, in a ballroom where silence proved sharper than laughter, the first fracture appeared. And soon, the cracks in his mask of power would be impossible to hide. The silence broke not with laughter but with a voice clear as glass. "Good evening, Mr. Hale," Elena said, her words measured, her tone calm. Every syllable carried strength, every sound crisp and precise. There was no stumble, no hesitation. Her English was flawless. The room shifted. Forks paused mid-air. Guests turned their heads sharply, as if they had misheard. The orchestra froze again, their bows hanging above strings. In that single sentence, the balance of power tilted. Richard blinked, his smirk flickering for the first time. He had expected retreat. He had expected stammering. Instead, the voice that answered him was polished, controlled, and stronger than his insult. For a heartbeat, the ballroom hung between disbelief and revelation. Then the whispers began. Her accent is gone. Perfect diction. She sounds professional. The contrast was unbearable for Richard. His weapon had been humiliation, but humiliation loses its edge when the target refuses to bend. His grin returned, sharper now, laced with irritation. He raised his glass higher and let his voice cut again. "Well rehearsed," he said, loud enough for the back tables. "Maybe you practiced for weeks to sound this way for tonight. But accents don't lie, and no amount of copying can make a servant into an equal." A few loyal guests forced a laugh, but it was thin, brittle. The earlier chorus of amusement was gone. Most eyes no longer looked at Richard with admiration. They looked at Elena, waiting. Elena did not flinch. She placed her tray on a nearby table, freeing her hands. She stood straighter, her posture tall beneath the weight of her uniform. When she spoke again, her words moved like a blade through silence. "I did not practice for you, Mr. Hale. I learned because words matter. Language is not a costume. 'Tis a bridge." Gasps rippled across the tables. Her voice was calm, but the truth in it struck harder than anger could. Guests leaned forward, some nodding slightly, others frozen with wide eyes. For the first time that evening, applause seemed possible, though no one dared begin it. Richard's jaw tightened. He pressed forward, voice louder, desperate to restore dominance. "You serve drinks. I build empires. Don't confuse borrowed words with real power." But even as he spoke, he felt it. The eyes of the room had left him. They no longer hung on his suit or his glass. They were fixed on her, on the waitress who refused to break. The chandeliers glimmered above, casting light over the two figures locked in silent combat. On one side, wealth and arrogance wrapped in designer fabric. On the other, a uniform that hid brilliance beneath simple cloth. The contrast was sharper than steel. Elena inhaled slowly, steady as a stone. Then she spoke again, not in English. Her words spilled into the air in a second language, smooth, fluid, unmistakably fluent. The room erupted in shock. Forks clattered against plates. Guests turned to one another, startled, whispering furiously. Some recognized the language instantly. Others sat in stunned silence, too overwhelmed to follow. Richard froze. His glass hovered in midair. The smirk that had carried him through countless stages faltered completely. He stared at her, unable to disguise his confusion, and Elena held his gaze, steady and unyielding. Her voice carried not just words but a promise. This battle had only begun. The second voice was not English, yet it rang with the same clarity. Elena's words flowed into French, elegant and fluid, each syllable pronounced with the grace of a native. The hall gasped as though a curtain had been pulled back to reveal a hidden stage. Waiters paused mid-step, glasses trembling in their hands. Guests exchanged stunned looks. Richard Hale's smirk froze in place. He understood only fragments, but he knew enough to sense control slipping. Elena did not stop. Her tone shifted again, and now it was Spanish. The vowels curved warmly, confidently, with none of the hesitation that might betray study. She spoke as one who had lived within the rhythm of the language, not as one who borrowed it for display. Each sentence landed like a strike. Every new word peeled away another layer of his authority. The crowd's shock deepened. Some guests clapped softly, instinctively, not as applause but as recognition of something rare. Others covered their mouths, whispering, counting the tongues as they emerged. Richard cleared his throat, desperate to cut through the rising awe. "Parlor tricks," he muttered. loud enough for the front tables. But his voice was thinner now, lacking the weight it once carried. Elena moved forward one step. Her apron brushed against her uniform, but she no longer seemed dressed for service. In that moment, her clothing became symbolic, a disguise that had fooled the arrogant, now dissolving under truth. She spoke again, this time in German. Strong consonants, precise and unbroken. Her words struck like iron against stone. Heads turned in every direction, as more guests realized they were hearing a tongue they understood personally. The humiliation was not in her words, but in the silence that followed. Richard, the master of spectacles, stood mute, watching his stage shift beneath him. Then came Italian. Smooth, lyrical, each phrase like music echoing across marble halls. The orchestra players in the corner, frozen since the first insult, exchanged glances of astonishment. It was as if their instruments had found a rival in human voice. Every language became more than sound. It became a mirror. Each shift revealed how little Richard truly possessed. Wealth had bought him power, but it had not bought him understanding. His billions could not summon even a single fluent sentence beyond his own tongue. Elena pressed forward, unhurried, her voice steady. Arabic followed, deep and resonant, its cadence rolling across the ballroom like a tide. Then Mandarin, sharp yet controlled, carrying the weight of centuries in its tones. The contrast could not be sharper. The waitress who served glasses spoke with the authority of civilizations. The crowd was no longer whispering. They were leaning forward, eyes wide, faces lit with a strange mix of awe and shame. Some felt guilty for laughing earlier. Others felt inspired, watching a hidden brilliance rise against arrogance. Richard's face tightened. He tried to laugh, but no sound came. His fingers clenched around his glass, knuckles pale under chandelier light. Elena's voice changed again. Russian now. Heavy consonants, steady rhythm, flawless in its delivery. Each word hung like a hammer in the air. By now no one doubted. She was not performing tricks. She was revealing truth. 8 tongues had passed through her lips. Each one stripped him further. Each one elevated her higher, and then she stopped. The hall waited, breathless, her eyes fixed on Richard, calm, unshaken. Her final words came softly, in Japanese, the 9th tongue. Gentle, deliberate, carrying a dignity that pierced deeper than any insult could. The room fell into absolute silence. No whisper, no cough, no scrape of fork against plate. The chandeliers glowed above, but all eyes stayed locked on her. Richard's face drained of color. His mouth opened as if to reply, but no words came. For the first time in memory, the master of the stage stood voiceless before his audience. And in that silence, the hall itself seemed to understand. Power built on mockery had just collapsed in front of them. The hall was silent, but inside Elena's mind, voices from the past rose like echoes. She stood steady before the frozen crowd. Richard Hale, pale and wordless, yet her thoughts were not on him. They drifted back to narrow streets, dim lights, and nights filled with books instead of rest. As a child, her world had been marked not by abundance, but by scarcity. Her family owned few possessions, but her father kept a box of second-hand books rescued from flea markets. Some were torn, some missing pages, yet each carried a language beyond her own. She traced the words with small fingers, sounding them aloud into the shadows of their modest kitchen. When electricity failed, she read by candlelight. When food was thin, she fed on dictionaries. Poverty had closed doors, but words opened windows. Her mother worked long shifts at a factory, her hands scarred by labor, yet she returned each night asking Elena to read aloud in whatever tongue she had learned that day. French sentences at the table, Spanish phrases by the stove, Italian whispered before sleep. The family did not understand every word, but they understood pride. Scholarships became her lifeline. Each award was not only a step forward, but proof that sacrifice carried weight. She spent nights in libraries translating texts for professors, her payment often no more than gratitude and another stack of books. But each translation sharpened her skill, and each late hour stitched resilience into her bones. The hall remained hushed as her memories folded into the present. She could feel the weight of those years pressing against her uniform now, as if every late-night lamp and every worn-out dictionary had walked into the ballroom with her. Her brilliance had not been born from privilege. It had been built from hunger, from silence, from a determination to turn lack into abundance. The guests who stared at her now saw a woman in black and white cloth. But behind her eyes stood the girl who had whispered German verbs into the night, while neighbors laughed at her stubbornness. They saw a waitress. She remembered the student who practiced Mandarin tones by recording her own voice on an old cassette player. They saw service. She remembered survival, and now, the same voice that had carried her through hardship carried 9 languages into the heart of a ballroom designed for power. Richard's insult had been meant to reduce her to silence, yet silence had been her teacher. Nights too quiet for comfort had trained her ear. Days too harsh for rest had given her reason to rise. The humiliation she had endured only moments before was already reframed inside her. It was not shame but proof. Proof that arrogance could not erase dignity. Proof that wealth could not replace wisdom. Proof that the child who had read broken books beneath failing light now stood unshaken before chandeliers and power. The crowd shifted uneasily, as though sensing the invisible past that stood with her. Some lowered their heads, ashamed of their earlier laughter. Others straightened, inspired by the sight of strength forged through struggle. Elena did not speak again, not yet. She let the silence linger, her eyes steady, her posture tall. The story had already been told, not in chapters, but in the weight of her presence. In the stillness of the ballroom, humiliation had turned to triumph. The chandelier light no longer crowned Richard Hale. It exposed him. For most of the evening, the ballroom had obeyed his rhythm. Laughter rose when he lifted a brow. Silence fell when he paused. But now the room's pulse had changed. After Elena's 9 tongues, the golden glass above seemed like decoration for someone else's victory. Setup came quick. Journalists along the back wall exchanged sharp nods and raised their phones higher. Board members seated near the front leaned in close to whisper names and outcomes. A publicist touched her headset like a shield. The orchestra remained frozen, bows hovering as if music might shatter what was left of his authority. Richard tried to reclaim the stage. He lifted his glass for a toast, voice pitched to reach the corners. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, forcing a laugh, "we've enjoyed a colorful display. Let's return to business." But business did not return to him. Eyes drifted to Elena. She stood with hands folded, calm and upright, her uniform plain against the glow. The contrast cut deep. His suit worth a car, her apron worth a shift. His arrogance borrowed from wealth, her dignity earned by work. Rising conflict rolled through the tables. A director from the board cleared his throat and did not smile. A reporter whispered, "Did you record all 9? Another replied, "Every word." The room was no longer his audience. It was evident. Richard's next move was sharper, more desperate. "We celebrate excellence," he said, projecting confidence. "But tonight we honor leadership. Not tricks." The word tricks snapped like a dry branch. A few guests flinched. Others stared at the tablecloth rather than help him. A senior board member, gray at the temples and steady in tone, spoke without rising. "Leadership respects people." He did not look at Richard when he said it. He looked at Elena. The message was plain. The journalists smelled a break in the wall. Questions formed like arrows. "Mr. Hale, do you regret your earlier remark? Is this your company culture? Would you like to apologize to the staff member?" Richard waved a hand. "No need for theatrics," he said, but the words were thin. The more he pushed, the less the room moved. Across the aisle, a young analyst whispered to her colleague, "This is going to trend by midnight." Another guest added softly, "It already is." Screens lit under tables as messages flew. A CEO mocked a waitress. The waitress replied in 9 languages. He could not answer. The climax beat arrived not with a shout but with a choice. A board director stood. He buttoned his jacket, faced Elena, and spoke in one of her languages, the 4th she had used. His tone was respectful. "Thank you," he said, clear and public. He then shifted to English. "Your professionalism honors this event." Applause began in a small circle and spread like light on water. It was not loud, but it was firm. It did not belong to Richard. It belonged to the room. Richard felt the ground tilt. He tried the old weapon, a confident smile, but the mask worked against him now. Under the chandelier, the smile looked painted. The cracks everyone suspected became visible. His hand shook just enough to show in the cameras. A reporter stepped forward. "Mr. Hale, we're told there were other incidents with staff this quarter. Are you aware?" Phones lifted higher. A publicist mouthed no questions too late. Elena did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence acted like a mirror, and the room chose what it wanted to see. Dignity standing without armor. The uniform that once hid her now served as symbol. Simple cloth outshone polished steel. A younger board member, eyes on the journalists, typed a brief message and slid his phone to the chair beside him. The screen showed a 3-word note: "Emergency session tomorrow." The recipient read it, swallowed, and nodded. From the back, a camera light blinked red. Clips would be cut, captions drafted, headlines sharpened. The story had everything the world watched for: wealth versus worth, noise versus truth, glamour collapsing under a single steady voice. Richard took one step toward Elena, then stopped. He looked left for allies and found only faces weighing risk. He looked right for laughter and found only quiet. He lowered his glass. The sound of crystal touching linen was small, but it echoed. Closure came as a whisper that moved row to row, table to table, like wind through tall grass. "He's finished. Votes are lining up. Stock will drop at open." Statement by dawn. The ballroom did not cheer. Did not need to. It watched, it waited, and somewhere between the chandeliers and the apron, a future was already changing shape. Open loop. By the time the lights dimmed, the rumor had a schedule, an internal review, a public apology, and something colder underneath it all: talk of removal before the week was out. The microphone waited like a mirror that would not lie. Setup formed in a hush. The ballroom stood between two truths: the old one built by Richard Hale's swagger, and the new one shaped by Elena's calm. Board members exchanged quiet notes. Journalists steadied their cameras. The orchestra packed their instruments as if music no longer belonged to this room. Richard reached the microphone first. His smile looked borrowed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "let's keep perspective. Tonight is about leadership and growth." His voice searched for the old rhythm and found none. "If anyone felt offended by a misunderstanding, that was not my intention." The words fell flat. They did not carry weight. They carried fear. Rising conflict returned when a reporter called out, "Will you apologize to the staff member you mocked?" Another added, "Is ridicule your leadership style?" Richard's jaw flexed. "We're not here for theatrics," he replied. "We're here for results." But the room had already chosen a different result. Eyes moved past him to Elena. The host, trembling but brave, stepped forward and lifted the second microphone toward her. The gesture was simple and clean, like a door finally opened. Elena did not rush. She touched her uniform as if to anchor herself, then stood straight beneath the chandelier light. The apron, once a symbol of invisibility, now looked like armor built from work and patience. She took the microphone. Her voice was clear. "We share rooms like this," she said, "but we do not always share respect." She looked at the guests, then at the cameras, then at Richard last. Language can be used to build or to break. Tonight it was used to break. She paused. "I will use it to build." The hall listened. No clink of glass, no whisper of linen, only breathing and light. "I learned 9 languages because I needed bridges," Elena continued. "At home we did not have much. We had books. They became ladders. I climbed them word by word, not to impress, to understand." She lifted her eyes to the balcony where the journalist stood. "Understanding is not a trick. It is work." Richard stepped closer, as if to interrupt, but the board chair raised a hand, halting him without a word. The gesture was quiet authority. The old order shifted another inch. Climax arrived in sentences simple and sharp. "Dignity does not wear a price tag," Elena said. "It belongs to the person who refuses to trade it. Respect is not charity. It is the minimum we owe each other. When language is used like a weapon, it does not prove strength. It reveals weakness." She turned slightly toward the staff lined along the wall. "To those who serve in silence," she said, "your work is not small. If people fail to see your worth, it is their vision that is small." She faced the crowd again. "Tonight I spoke in 9 tongues, but the message is one. A voice is not measured by its accent. It is measured by its honesty. A murmur of assent moved through the room. It sounded like relief. Elena set the microphone on the podium, then lifted a fresh glass of water, steady, ceremonial. "To every guest here," she said, "I will still serve with care. Service is not less than power. It is another kind of power, quiet, exact, and chosen." Richard tried one last time. "Impressive speech," he said, forcing lightness. "But this is business, not a lesson." Elena met his gaze. "Business is also a lesson," she answered, gentle but firm. "It teaches what a company believes. When leaders use disdain, they teach fear. When leaders show respect, they teach value. Only one of those lessons lasts." The board chair stood. "Thank you, Ms. Elena," he said, using her name with deliberate respect. He turned to the crowd. "As for the company's lesson, there will be a statement in the morning." The meaning was plain. Closure settled like dawn, soft but decisive. Applause rose, not wild, not cruel, but clean. It honored the idea she carried more than the spectacle they had watched. Staff members stood taller. Journalists lowered their cameras for a breath, as if to let the moment live before they captured it. Elena lifted the tray she had set down earlier. The simple circle of polished metal caught the light and tossed it back across the room. A symbol finished its work. The tray had once marked her place beneath others. Now it reflected every face in the hall, equal under the same light. She nodded to the host, to the orchestra, to the guests who had found their better selves. She did not bow. She did not need to. She returned to her station with calm steps, the uniform resting on her shoulders like a story that had finally been told without shame. Outside the windows, the city moved in its many languages, buses sighing, tires whispering, people crossing streets with private hopes. Inside, a truth remained. Words can wound, but they can also heal. They can close doors, or they can build bridges wide enough for all of us to cross. True wealth, the room understood at last, is not the glitter on a wrist or the name on a tower. True wealth is the habit of respect, the courage to see dignity in others, and the choice, again and again, to build a bridge where a wall once stood.